A warm welcome to all of you, dear listeners, tuning into our show today. Today's story is titled, Temptation from a Benefactor's Wife. Sometimes, even when we know it's wrong, we can be blinded by temptation, leading us to commit acts of betrayal against those who've shown us kindness. This is the story of a man who, after serving time in prison, is helped by a former inmate to rebuild his life. But his benefactor's young wife becomes a powerful temptation for someone who has never experienced the pleasures of the world. Let's listen as the story unfolds. Walter felt a heavy weight in his chest as he looked at Ethan. He felt like an ungrateful, disloyal person. His heart ached. He had promised himself he would stop, wouldn't touch Ethan's wife. Thinking it was one thing, but acting on it was another. During the day, it was fine, but at night, he couldn't resist when Olivia seduced him, offered herself to him. Olivia had learned her tricks from the hostesses at the karaoke bar next door. Many times Walter had said stop, but the beauty would get angry and sulk. How could a man resist when a woman was like that, especially when her husband was away for so long? He thought. Olivia, we can't keep doing this. He stammered. If you don't say anything, who's going to know? It's not like we live in a small town where everyone gossips. Olivia just laughed, her voice like silk. Come on, Walter, don't be like that. Just one more time. Don't worry, I'm not going to pressure you into anything once Ethan's back. Dear listeners, this is a difficult situation for a man in his 60s who's only now experiencing the temptations of the world. Let's delve deeper into this intriguing story. The sweltering June air buzzed with the deafening drone of cicadas behind the eucalyptus grove. Not a breath of wind stirred, not a shadow offered respite from the oppressive heat. Inside a stifling concrete cell, sealed tight with iron bars, over 100 square meters teemed with almost 50 men, their bodies crammed together in the thick, heavy air. The suffocating atmosphere pressed down upon them. Walter squinted at the sliver of sky peeking through the bars and the layer of wire mesh. He glanced occasionally at the men below, a mix of ages, sizes, and stories etched onto their skin. Some bore elaborate tattoos, while others still had faces smooth with youth. All of them fell under his watchful eye. In this concrete jungle, they called him Walter, not because he was old, but because he was the eldest among them. He was a man who commanded respect, a seasoned veteran in this desolate mountain prison. He had been incarcerated since he was 20, convicted on drug charges while working as a hired driver, transporting goods from the border to the city and back. The life sentence had been a bolt from the blue, a cruel twist of fate he never saw coming. To this day, he still didn't understand how those 2 bricks ended up in his truck. He maintained his innocence, a claim that had fallen on deaf ears for over 3 decades. His parents had passed away while he was locked up, and he had lost contact with relatives who couldn't bear the thought of visiting. His life had been reduced to these 4 walls and the company of fellow inmates. He had entered prison a young man, full of life and dreams, and emerged decades later a hardened, middle-aged convict. Being placed in Walter's cell was an aspiration for every prisoner in this facility. His demeanor commanded respect, yet he treated his fellow inmates with a fairness that bordered on kindness. While he didn't shy away from using force when necessary, he never did so without cause. Even though a clear hierarchy existed within the cell, there was none of the usual brutality and oppression found elsewhere. This prison had its own unwritten rules, but in Walter's domain, they were enforced with a degree of fairness and restraint. All that was asked of his fellow inmates was to know their place and obey. Thanks to his unwavering authority among his fellow inmates and the goodwill he had earned from the officers, Walter's life sentence had been commuted to a fixed term the previous year. It was a glimmer of hope in the darkness, a chance to reclaim the life that had been stolen from him so long ago. Since then, a quiet peace had settled over him, a stark contrast to the simmering tension that had defined his existence for decades. This newfound tranquility seemed to permeate the entire cell block. However, these past few days, a strange unease had gripped him. His nights were plagued by insomnia, and his days were filled with a restless anxiety he couldn't shake off. The previous week, he'd caught wind from one of the guards that his name was on the upcoming amnesty list. All that remained was the official announcement. The joy he should have felt was muted, dampened by a profound apprehension. 30 years of confinement had taken their toll. The thought of freedom, once a distant dream, now filled him with uncertainty. He was stepping out into a world that had moved on without him. How would he adapt to a society so different from the one he remembered? Where would he go? Who would he meet? What would he do with the rest of his life? These questions weighed heavily on his mind, aging him visibly. Even his hair seemed to have grayed more in the past week. Something bothering you, Pops? You look a little down. Kevin, one of the younger inmates, asked cautiously, sidling up to him. It's nothing. Walter replied softly, closing his eyes as if seeking refuge. Let's roll some tobacco to lift the spirits, Pops, Kevin suggested, referring to the makeshift cigarettes they rolled using scraps of newspaper. Go on, find somewhere else to sit. Let me rest. Walter mumbled, his eyes still closed. Kevin, sensing his elder's mood, quietly retreated to join the other inmates. To the older convicts, Walter was their respected leader, a figure of authority they addressed as boss. The younger ones, like Kevin, called him Pops. Even the guards treated him with a degree of respect, usually addressing him as Mr. Walter. This spoke volumes about his standing within the prison walls. He had never craved power for its own sake, but in this concrete jungle, sometimes the only way to survive was to rise above the rest. It was a position he'd earned through blood and sacrifice, though deep down, it was a burden he'd rather not bear. A sudden clatter echoed from the hallway, the distinct rhythm of approaching footsteps. The clang of metal on metal resonated as the outer gate swung open with a deafening boom. 2 guards escorted a young man into the cell block. He was pale and slim, his face still carrying the remnants of youthful innocence. Go on in. One of the guards barked, shoving the young man lightly. Then, turning to Walter, he said, You got new company, Walter. Yes, sir. Walter responded calmly, his eyes still half closed. The gate clanged shut behind the newcomer, marking the beginning of another sentence. As the guards retreated, Kevin, ever eager to assert his authority, swiftly approached the young man and landed a resounding slap on his back, sending him stumbling forward. Hey, you trying to blind us with that flashlight? Kevin roared, his face contorted in mock anger. You trying to blindside your elders? I'm sorry. The young man stammered, his face a mask of fear and confusion. I just got here. I didn't know. Please, tell me what to do. Just shut up and get down there to the back. Kevin sneered, pointing to the darkest corner of the cell. I'll deal with you later. The young man, too intimidated to disobey, crawled to the designated spot and stayed put, not daring to make a sound. Throughout this exchange, Walter remained impassive, his face revealing nothing of his thoughts. Later that evening, after the 8 p.m. meal, when the inmates had finished eating and the trays were cleared away, Kevin sat perched on the edge of his bunk, surveying the room with a practiced air of authority. He pointed to the young man, who was still huddled in the corner where he had been banished earlier that day. You, get over here, he bellowed. The young man obediently crawled towards him, keeping his head bowed submissively. Start talking. Name, hometown, crime, sentence. Let's hear it. Kevin demanded. What should I say? The young man mumbled, his voice barely audible. Kevin slammed his fist against the metal bunk, making the newcomer flinch. Are you stupid or something? What did they teach you out there in the real world, huh? Kevin, that's enough. Walter interjected, his voice quiet but firm. He shot Kevin a disapproving look, and the younger man immediately fell silent. Go on, son, Walter said gently, nodding at the young man. My name is Ethan. I'm 25. I'm from Willow Creek, Maple County. Ethan began, his voice trembling slightly. Walter's hand, which had been casually swirling the watery gruel in his bowl, suddenly froze. Willow Creek. It had been decades since he'd heard anyone utter the name of his hometown. He listened intently as Ethan continued, each word a pinprick to his heart. You there, get up here. Walter commanded, beckoning Ethan with a jerk of his chin. Ethan, confused, looked from Kevin to the source of the deeper voice. Kevin, understanding the silent command, nodded towards Walter. Ethan nervously crawled over to Walter, settling on his knees before the older man. "Who are your people, son? Where in Willow Creek are you from?" Walter asked, his voice steady and firm. "My dad's name is Henry. My mom is Jolie. We lived in the East End," Ethan replied. "People call my father Henry Cripple. Do you know him?" A flicker of hope sparked in Ethan's eyes as if he'd found a lifeline. Walter nodded slowly, 1,000 memories flooding his mind. "Your father, he's a few years younger than me. We used to herd buffalo and cut grass together as kids. He wasn't even married to Jolie when I went away." "You're from Willow Creek, too?" Ethan asked, unable to hide his surprise. Walter replied, a wistful look clouding his eyes. It was the first time in over 3 decades he'd encountered someone from his own village, let alone his own hometown. "Tell me, son, how did you end up here?" "I got 3 years for assault," Ethan mumbled. "You, with that baby face? You don't strike me as a fighter," Walter said, a flicker of amusement crossing his features for the first time that evening. "It's a long story, sir," Ethan began. Kevin, sensing an opportunity to insert himself, interrupted. "So, Pops, what's the protocol for this one? The usual treatment?" "Not tonight, Kevin," Walter said, cutting him off. "We'll let him off easy on the initiation tonight." With a subtle gesture, Walter dismissed both Kevin and Ethan. Kevin scurried away, 2 sharp smacks of his flip-flops echoing in the quiet cell as he went. As the other inmates drifted off to sleep, their snores providing a steady rhythm to the night, only Walter and Ethan remained awake. Walter was lost in thought, his heart heavy with the bittersweet memories of home that Ethan had stirred up. As for Ethan, sleep was impossible. His life, a promising career, a loving wife, a beautiful baby girl, had been upended in a heartbeat by a single impulsive act. The reality of his situation, compounded by the painful welcome he had received earlier, made it impossible to relax. "Tell me, son," Walter said, his voice barely a whisper. "How did you end up in a place like this?" And so Ethan began to recount the events that had led to his imprisonment. He spoke of graduating college, marrying his sweetheart, and how her family had helped them open a clothing boutique in the city. Business had been good, he explained, but lately, they'd been facing some stiff competition and a hostile business dispute. Ethan's voice lowered as he described the escalating harassment from their rivals. Then, 3 months ago, a group of thugs had shown up at the shop, threatening violence and causing chaos. Ethan, fearing for the safety of his employees and his wife, had called some friends for backup. A fight had broken out, leaving 2 of the aggressors seriously injured, one barely clinging to life. Ethan had been arrested and charged with aggravated assault, facing a hefty sentence due to the severity of the injuries and the fact that he had called for reinforcements. Walter listened intently, his face etched with concern. "Yours is a light sentence, son. Keep your nose clean, and you'll be out of here in no time." Ethan sighed. "I know, sir. Right now, all I can do is serve my time." As the night wore on, their conversation shifted to more familiar territory. Ethan spoke of their shared hometown, filling in the gaps of Walter's memories with news and gossip from Willow Creek. He described the changing landscape, the new houses, the gossip about their former neighbors. Although Ethan's account was fragmented and incomplete, it was enough to bring tears to Walter's eyes. It had been decades since he'd been back, decades since he had last seen his parents, who were now both gone. He'd thought that time, along with the harsh realities of prison life, had hardened him, had turned his heart to stone. But the love for his family, his village, his hometown had never truly faded. It had merely been suppressed, buried deep within, waiting for a chance to resurface. Still, a lifetime of keeping his emotions in check had taught him restraint. He let out a small sigh, the only outward sign of the turmoil raging within him. Ethan, focused on his own troubles, didn't notice the older man's reaction, and continued to talk, his head bowed as if in deference to his cellmate's quiet authority. From that first night onward, Ethan, despite being the new inmate, found himself treated with unusual kindness by Walter. Be it a preferred sleeping spot, extra food, or lighter work assignments, Ethan received preferential treatment. Perhaps it was the shared hometown connection, or perhaps it was the valuable information Ethan had provided about Walter's family. Whatever the reason, Walter had clearly taken the younger man under his wing. It took Ethan nearly a month to fully adjust to the routines and rhythms of prison life. Gradually, he began to accept his fate, even finding a sliver of hope in his misfortune. Meeting Walter, he realized, had been a stroke of luck. Walter, too, seemed to benefit from Ethan's presence. He smiled more often, engaged in conversation more readily, and even allowed himself moments of humor. In the evenings, he would invite Ethan to sit with him on his bunk, a privilege none of the other inmates had ever enjoyed. They would talk late into the night, sharing stories and confidences like the closest of friends. When the official announcement of Walter's amnesty came through, the entire prison rejoiced. Everywhere he went, he was greeted with cheers and congratulations. Yet, as his release date drew near, a strange anxiety took hold of him. It was as if his mind, so accustomed to the confines of prison life, now recoiled at the thought of freedom. He had heard stories from the newer inmates, and his own imagination painted a daunting picture of the world outside. It was a world transformed, more modern, more technologically advanced, more sophisticated. He wondered if he could ever find his place in this new world. Where would he go? Who would welcome him after all these years? Returning to Willow Creek was out of the question. There was no one left for him there, and the thought of facing those who knew his past filled him with shame. The uncertainty gnawed at him, day and night. That night, as the other inmates slept soundly around them, Walter and Ethan lay awake on their bunks. "So, Pops, what are your plans after you get out?" Ethan asked, turning to face the older man. Walter sighed, a weary sound that spoke volumes about the uncertainty gnawing at him. "I honestly haven't got a clue, son. How about I ask my wife to help you out? Maybe she can find you a place to stay, maybe even a job. What do you think?" Walter chuckled humorlessly. "Who'd hire an old jailbird like me?" "Don't talk like that, Pops. You're still strong and capable. You're barely 60. There are plenty of jobs out there for someone willing to work hard. Besides," Ethan added with a playful nudge, "you still have time to find a wife, settle down, and have a family of your own." Ethan's casual mention of marriage and family hung heavy in the air. For most inmates, it was a painful reminder of the lives they had left behind. For Walter, it was a poignant reminder of a path he had never known. He had lived more than half his life without ever experiencing the love of a woman, the joys of fatherhood. Now, with his release imminent, he couldn't help but feel a pang of regret. "Tell me honestly, son," Walter asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "What kind of work do you think someone like me could find out there?" "Oh, tons of things, Pops," Ethan said enthusiastically. "Security guard, delivery driver, maybe even a rideshare driver. There are tons of options. You just gotta be willing to try." "You really think so?" "Absolutely. Don't tell me you're scared to join the real world now?" Ethan teased. "Well," Walter hesitated. "So it's settled then," Ethan said, cutting him off. "I'll talk to Olivia. She'll know what to do." Walter nodded, a sliver of hope flickering amidst the uncertainty. "Come on, Pops," Ethan said, clapping Walter on the shoulder. "Let's get some rest. We've got a big day tomorrow." Exhaustion finally claimed them, and they drifted off to sleep, unaware of the changes that awaited them both. The next day was Visitors' Day at the prison. It was the first time Ethan had seen his wife and daughter since his incarceration several months prior. The reunion was a tearful affair. Their baby girl, barely a year old, stared wide-eyed at her parents through the small, scratched windowpane that separated them. Tears streamed down Ethan and Olivia's faces as they tried to bridge the distance with whispered words and longing glances. Olivia, Ethan's wife, was also 25. They had been college sweethearts, she the campus beauty queen, he a star athlete. A match made in heaven, they had married soon after graduation. Their daughter had inherited the best of both worlds, her father's bright, expressive eyes, and her mother's delicate features and porcelain skin. The young couple chatted excitedly, catching up on life inside the prison and out. Olivia described how the thugs who had attacked the shop were still causing trouble. They hadn't done anything serious since Ethan's arrest, but their occasional presence was a constant source of anxiety for Olivia and the baby. Ethan listened, his jaw clenched, his fingers gripping the edge of the table. He had been consumed with guilt and worry ever since his arrest, hating that his actions had put his family in such a vulnerable position. As if remembering something important, Ethan leaned in closer to his wife. "There's this older gentleman, Walter, a friend of mine in here. He's getting out soon, and he doesn't have anywhere to go," he explained in a low voice. "Maybe we could offer him a place to stay, help him find a job or something. I feel like I owe him one." "Well, we'll see what we can do. I'll think about it," Olivia replied cautiously. Their time together flew by, ending as always in tears and promises to write. That night, as Ethan and Walter lay talking in their bunks, Ethan brought up Walter's living arrangements again. He explained his idea of asking Olivia for help, his voice firm with determination. It was as if he'd found a way to ease his conscience, a way to repay his debt to the older man. He had no idea that this well-intentioned plan would lead to the biggest mistake of his life. Finally, the long-awaited day of Walter's release arrived. After a brief ceremony in the prison yard, the inmates, their faces a mixture of anticipation and apprehension, lined up to receive their discharge papers and walk out the gates to freedom. There was a festive atmosphere as families reunited, horns honked, and engines roared. Walter stood apart from the crowd, his only belongings a worn duffel bag slung over his shoulder. He watched as his fellow inmates were greeted by loved ones, their faces etched with relief and joy. He envied their happiness, their sense of belonging. He was alone. As he stepped out of the prison gates, Walter tilted his head back, feeling the warmth of the sun on his face. He took a deep breath, savoring the taste of freedom, the sweet, intoxicating air of a world he had almost forgotten. It was time to begin a new chapter. His meager possessions, a few sets of clothes and the discharge papers that granted him a conditional release, were all he had to show for a lifetime spent behind bars. The sun was beginning to set as Walter made his way to the village cemetery. He stood before two weathered headstones, side by side, marking the final resting place of his parents. The scent of incense filled the air as he knelt, his eyes welling up, whispering a prayer for forgiveness, his words carried away on the gentle breeze. Walter gazed towards the village, towards the spot where his family home used to stand. Ethan had told him that a cousin now lived there. The village looked so different now, the familiar thatched huts of his childhood replaced by modern houses, their roofs a jumble of exotic designs. Even the dirt paths he remembered had given way to paved roads. It was as if time had erased every trace of his past, leaving him unmoored, adrift in a sea of change. He brushed away a tear and quickly turned away, heading back towards the road. He hailed a passing car, desperate to escape the ghosts of his past. The city welcomed him with its chaotic energy. For days, he wandered aimlessly, riding buses, eating street food, trying to quench a thirst that had been building for decades. But this period of aimless freedom was short-lived. The small amount of money he had received upon his release dwindled rapidly. The reality of his situation, jobless, homeless, and alone in a city that felt like a foreign country, hit him hard. He remembered Ethan's parting words, and rummaged through his bag until he found the crumpled letter Ethan had asked him to deliver to his wife. Following the address, Walter found himself standing before a stylish boutique. "Hello, sir. Can I help you?" a sweet voice called out from behind him. Walter turned, startled. Standing in the doorway was the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. She was tall and slender, her fair skin glowing in the afternoon light. A stylish dress clung to her curves, the neckline dipping low enough to reveal a hint of cleavage. Walter stared, speechless. He had spent 30 years surrounded by men, and now, here she was, an angel descended from heaven. The woman cleared her throat, bringing Walter back to reality. "Sir, you're looking for someone?" "Yes, I'm here to see Olivia," he stammered, his face flushing with a mixture of desire and shame. He fumbled in his bag for the letter. "Right this way, sir." Please come in and have a seat. I'll get her for you," Olivia said, leading him inside. Walter followed, his eyes glued to her swaying hips, his heart pounding in his chest. He scolded himself for his thoughts, but he couldn't help but stare. "Please, have a seat, sir. Can I get you something to drink?" Olivia offered, gesturing towards a plush armchair. Walter nodded gratefully, taking the glass of iced tea she offered. Olivia glanced down at the letter Walter had handed her, her brow furrowing slightly as she deciphered Ethan's scrawled handwriting. Her husband had mentioned this friend of his in prison, the one he felt indebted to, but she hadn't been expecting this. "You were released recently?" she asked, her gaze sweeping over Walter's tall frame and weathered features. "Yes, ma'am, a few days ago." "And you have a place to stay? Have you found work yet?" Walter shook his head, unable to meet her eyes. He felt a wave of shame wash over him. He was a burden, a charity case. "Don't worry, sir," Olivia said, her voice softening. "Ethan told me all about you. Why don't you have lunch here, and we'll figure things out? I'm sure I can find some of the staff to help you find a place to stay. And tomorrow, if you'd like, you could start with us, maybe as a security guard? We need someone to watch the storefront and help with parking." "Oh, and can you drive, by any chance?" Olivia added, her words tumbling out quickly, as if rehearsed. Walter straightened up, a glimmer of pride in his eyes. "Why, yes, ma'am. I used to be a driver, back in the day." "Perfect. Besides the security work, maybe you could help us with deliveries occasionally? We could really use the extra hands." Walter was overwhelmed by Olivia's kindness. "You're too kind, miss. I don't know what to say. I don't want to impose." Olivia laughed, a light, melodic sound that sent shivers down Walter's spine. "Please, sir, there's no need to be so formal. You're not imposing at all. You're Walter, right? Ethan told me how much you helped him in prison. It was a really tough time for him, so consider this a small token of our appreciation. Life inside is a million times harder than anything out here, trust me." She smiled reassuringly. "Besides, you'll be working for us, not the other way around. There's no need to feel indebted or anything." Walter gazed at Olivia, struck by her beauty and generosity. She was like a ray of sunshine, chasing away the shadows that had haunted him for so long. He couldn't tell if it was her sincerity or her beauty that had disarmed him. "Well, if you're sure it's not too much trouble." "Not at all. Now, it's almost lunchtime. Why don't you get settled in, and I'll have someone arrange a room for you. You can start tomorrow." And with that, Olivia was gone, her quick, efficient movements a testament to her business acumen. Walter, still bewildered by the unexpected turn of events, settled down to a lunch of takeout with the rest of the shop staff. He observed the young women as they chatted and laughed, their youthful energy filling the room. He couldn't help but smile. If things had been different, he thought wistfully, maybe he, too, would have had children this age. The shop assistants, all young and stylish in their short, brightly colored uniforms, paid little attention to the older man in their midst. But Walter was acutely aware of them, of their every move, their every laugh. He sat there, ostensibly cool and collected in the air-conditioned comfort of the shop, but inside, he was a furnace, his body battling a lifetime of suppressed desires. As the afternoon wore on, the shop buzzed with activity. Olivia's staff, efficient and tireless, bustled around, attending to customers, checking inventory, packing orders, and processing sales. Olivia herself was a whirlwind of energy, rarely seen on the shop floor. She spent most of her time upstairs, managing the business and caring for her daughter. Alone in the small room Olivia had provided for him, Walter didn't know what to do with himself. He sat there, watching the comings and goings of the staff through the open doorway. He couldn't help but notice their long, slender legs, their smooth, flawless skin. After decades of deprivation, his senses were overloaded. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clutching his duffel bag protectively. Occasionally, one of the young women would stop by, asking if he needed anything. Walter would just shake his head and mumble a thank you, embarrassed by his own thoughts. He marveled at the kindness he had encountered since arriving here. It was a world away from the harsh realities of prison life. He was starting to understand just how precious freedom truly was. As the day drew to a close and the shop quieted down, Olivia reappeared. "Mr. Walter," she said, "I spoke to the staff, and we found a motel room for you, just a short walk from here. You can stay there for now, and start work tomorrow, if that's still agreeable to you." "That's wonderful, miss. Thank you so much for everything." Walter stammered, his eyes accidentally falling to Olivia's chest. She had been breastfeeding her daughter, and a wet patch was clearly visible through the thin fabric of her blouse. Walter quickly averted his gaze, his thoughts spiraling in a direction he knew he shouldn't go. Olivia, noticing his discomfort, quickly called over one of the shop assistants. "Sarah, could you walk Mr. Walter to his motel? Make sure he knows how to get back here tomorrow." "Of course, Olivia," the young woman replied. "Thank you again, miss. You're too kind," Walter said, grabbing his duffel bag and following Sarah out the door. "Oh, one more thing," Olivia called after him. "What's your number? I'll save it, just in case." Walter blushed. "I don't have a phone, miss," he admitted sheepishly. "Oh, right, of course," Olivia said with a knowing smile. "Wait here a moment." She disappeared upstairs, returning a moment later with an older model smartphone. "You can use my husband's old phone for now," she explained. "Thank you, miss," Walter mumbled, overwhelmed by her generosity. He followed Sarah out of the shop, his head spinning with the day's events, the sounds of the city fading into the distance. Night fell, casting its blanket of darkness over the city. Lights flickered off, one by one, as people settled in for the night. On the third floor of the boutique, in a room bathed in the soft glow of a nightlight, a baby slept soundly in her crib. In the adjacent bedroom, on a bed meant for two bodies writhed together, their movements fueled by desire. The woman, her perfect form illuminated by the moonlight streaming through the window, was breathtakingly beautiful. Her long, slender legs were intertwined with those of her lover, the red silk sheet clinging to her curves like a second skin. Her pale flesh gleamed against the dark, muscular back of the man who hovered over her. The only sounds in the room were their ragged gasps for air, punctuated by the rhythmic slap of skin on skin. The man's back, slick with sweat, was a canvas of scratches and bite marks, a testament to their passionate encounter. The rumpled sheets and scattered clothing spoke of a battle fought and won. The woman, her head thrown back in abandon, was the undisputed queen of this domain. Her lover, a man old enough to be her father, was none other than Walter. Olivia's eyes flew open. "Oh God!" she gasped, sitting bolt upright in bed. Her heart pounded in her chest, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. It had been a dream, a terrifyingly vivid, unbelievably erotic dream. She lay back against the pillows, her forehead beaded with sweat, trying to make sense of the images that flashed behind her eyelids. How could she, a married woman, have such a dream, especially about a man like Walter? The sound of a rooster crowing in the distance, followed by the faint chirping of birds, signaled the start of a new day. Olivia, still shaken by her dream, lay awake long after the sounds of the city had filled the air. Downstairs, Walter was already at work, his initial awkwardness replaced by a quiet confidence. He went about his duties with a diligence that belied his age. Being a security guard wasn't glamorous, but for Walter, it was a godsend. He had food, shelter, and a purpose, a chance to rejoin society as a productive member. The feeling of gratitude was intoxicating. He had traded in his prison uniform for a crisp security uniform, his face clean-shaven, his hair neatly combed. He greeted customers with a friendly smile, his eyes twinkling with an inner peace he hadn't known in years. He helped with parking, unloaded deliveries, and even ran errands for the staff. Walter's work ethic and eagerness to please did not go unnoticed. Olivia and her staff, initially wary of the former convict in their midst, gradually warmed up to him. There was a quiet dignity about Walter, a sense of humility that put everyone at ease. His presence, far from being disruptive, seemed to have a calming effect on the entire shop. During his downtime, Walter often sat outside the boutique, chatting with the security guards from the karaoke bar next door, sharing cigarettes and stories. These young men were a window to the world he had missed. They filled him in on all the changes that had taken place during his incarceration, from the intricacies of smartphones and social media to the nuances of modern dating. Walter was like a student, eager to learn everything he could about the world he was re-entering. When business was slow, he would sit by the curb, watching the steady stream of people passing by, his eyes naturally drawn to the young women. He marveled at their revealing clothes, their carefree confidence. "The world has changed so much," he would mutter to himself, shaking his head. "Back in my day, women wouldn't be caught dead wearing such things. They'd be reprimanded, or worse, ostracized. But I suppose it's a good thing, in a way. After spending so many years in a concrete box, seeing so much beauty out in the open is a real treat." He chuckled, then winced, realizing his thoughts were straying into dangerous territory. His nights were often spent catching up on all the movies and shows he had missed, his old body struggling to keep up with his newfound freedom. One morning, as Walter was sitting by the curb, enjoying a cigarette, a group of 4 young men, barely out of their teens, sauntered towards the shop. The boutique staff, recognizing trouble, quickly retreated inside. Even the karaoke bar guards, sensing danger, abandoned their conversation with Walter and hurried back to their post. It was clear that this wasn't the first time this group had caused trouble. The most aggressive of the group, a wiry young man with a shock of blue hair, kicked over a display of sale signs, sending them scattering across the sidewalk. Walter, sensing trouble brewing, stood up and calmly approached the group. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" he asked, his voice cool and steady. Well, looks like the boutique has hired some geriatric muscle," sneered a tall, muscular youth with bleached blonde hair. He was clearly the leader of the pack. "Are you here to shop, or are you looking for trouble?" Walter pressed, refusing to be intimidated. "Ooh, tough guy, huh?" the blue-haired youth scoffed. "What's it to you if we're here to shop or cause trouble?" He took a menacing step toward Walter, grabbing the front of his shirt and shoving him back. The other youths closed in, ready for a fight. Walter's shirt ripped with a sharp tearing sound. Suddenly, the blonde youth froze, his face draining of color. His hands trembled as he rushed forward, grabbing the blue-haired youth by the collar and pulling him back. With a nervous bow, he turned to Walter, his voice shaking. "We didn't know, sir. We're so sorry. Please forgive us." He gestured at his companions, and the group, without another word, hurried away, disappearing down the street. The other youths were bewildered by their leader's sudden change of heart. Olivia and her staff, who had been watching from inside the shop, were equally surprised. Even Walter was confused. Once they were a safe distance away, the blue-haired youth finally spoke. "Spike, what the hell was that about? Why'd you drag us away like that? Did you see the tattoo on that old man?" Spike asked, his voice low and serious. "No, why?" "You wouldn't understand. Even I've only seen a tattoo like that a couple of times in my life," Spike explained, his voice still shaking. "But it was just a tiny little thing. What's the big deal?" Spike shook his head. "You're not old enough to understand. Just trust me. People with tattoos like that are not to be messed with. Let's go." And with that, the group disappeared, melting into the anonymity of the city. Back at the boutique, Walter had changed into a fresh shirt. Olivia and her staff were still buzzing with excitement, replaying the encounter in hushed tones. Only Olivia seemed unfazed. She had watched the entire incident unfold with a cool, appraising eye, a knowing smile playing on her lips. It was as if she was putting the pieces of a puzzle together, her mind already racing ahead. A moment later, things settled back to normal. Olivia, her composure restored, went back to work, and the rest of the staff followed suit, resuming their duties as if nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. As the day was drawing to a close, Olivia called Walter into her office. "Mr. Walter," she began, "I was wondering if I could ask you a favor?" "Anything, miss. Just name it." "You know how Ethan ended up in prison, right? You saw those thugs earlier today. Well," Olivia continued, I was wondering, would you be willing to move in here permanently? I mean, we could convert part of the storage room into a small apartment for you. That way, you could be here as a night guard, too." Walter stared at her, taken aback. "Are you sure that's a good idea, miss? I mean, think about it, Mr. Walter. Besides, we'll pay you extra for the night shift. And please, don't worry about imposing. You've already helped Ethan so much. This is the least we can do." "Well, it's not about the money, miss. It's just that I wouldn't want to make you uncomfortable." Olivia laughed. "Don't worry about that. My daughter and I live upstairs, completely separate from the shop. If I'm not worried, you shouldn't be either." Walter hesitated for a moment, still unsure. "I'll take that as a yes then," Olivia said decisively. "I'll call a contractor tonight. We'll clear out some of the inventory, put up a few walls, and you'll be all set. It should be ready by tomorrow." "Well, if you insist, miss." "It's settled then." The next day, as usual, Walter was the first to arrive, ready to open up the shop and sweep the sidewalk. His duffel bag, his only possession in the world, was now joined by a small backpack filled with toiletries and a change of clothes. While Walter had been busy with his duties, Olivia had already been hard at work. The storage room, adjacent to the stairwell, had been transformed. A small, private room had been created, complete with a bed, a dresser, and a small desk. Olivia had even added a comfortable armchair. The only thing missing was an air conditioner. For Walter, it was perfect. A steady job, decent living quarters, and a sense of belonging. He couldn't have asked for more. And most importantly, he was treated with respect, not shunned or judged for his past. He was grateful to Ethan and Olivia for giving him a second chance at life. He silently thanked the heavens for leading him to these two kind souls. Life settled into a comfortable routine. Walter spent his days diligently guarding the storefront, his evenings retreating to his cozy room in the back of the shop. His only vice was his newfound obsession with adult films. After decades of suppressed desires, Walter was like a man reborn, his body reawakened to the pleasures of the flesh. His proximity to the karaoke bar, with its steady stream of scantily clad hostesses, didn't help matters. The constant reminder of what he had missed, what he could never have, fueled a longing that was almost unbearable. The frustration was both exhilarating and tortuous. It was the agony of a starving man glimpsing a feast he could never partake in. Most nights, Walter resorted to self-gratification, the only way to quell the fire raging within him. Since Walter's arrival, Olivia had noticed a welcome change. The thugs who had harassed her and her staff had vanished. The nights were quiet, the sense of unease that had plagued her for months finally gone. One evening, after putting her daughter to bed, Olivia settled down with her phone, scrolling through social media as usual. She was engrossed in a series of funny videos when a notification popped up, warning her that her battery was low. She reached for her charger on the nightstand, but it wasn't there. She remembered leaving it downstairs by the cash register. Careful not to wake her daughter, she slipped out of bed and quietly made her way downstairs. As she passed Walter's room, she was startled by a series of strange sounds emanating from within. The door was slightly ajar, a sliver of light spilling out into the hallway. Walter must have forgotten to lock it after using the bathroom, she thought. As she drew closer, the sounds became more distinct. It was a woman's voice, moaning softly. Olivia's heart skipped a beat. Was Walter watching a movie? Her legs trembled as she tiptoed closer, her ears burning with a mixture of curiosity and shame. She felt like a thief, creeping around her own home. Peeking through the crack in the door, she saw Walter lying on his back on the narrow bed, his eyes glued to his phone screen, his free hand moving rhythmically beneath the sheets. Olivia's jaw dropped, and she almost cried out in shock. She quickly covered her mouth, her mind reeling. She couldn't believe that Walter, a man she had considered to be a kind, almost grandfatherly figure, would be doing that in her house. After the initial shock subsided, a strange tingling sensation spread through her body. She found herself comparing Walter to Ethan. Her cheeks flushed, her eyes widening as a wave of heat coursed through her. She quickly turned away, tiptoeing back upstairs, completely forgetting about her phone charger. Back in her room, she leaned against the door, her heart pounding like a drum. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her body flushed and hot. Beneath the bright light of the bedside lamp, her cheeks and ears burned crimson. Something felt wrong, terribly wrong. She shifted uncomfortably on the bed, the dampness beneath her making her feel even hotter. What was happening to her? She pinched her cheek, trying to shake off the unwelcome thoughts. She couldn't get the image of Walter out of her head. She tossed and turned, unable to sleep. Her body throbbed with a need that was both familiar and unwelcome. It had been so long. Months of postpartum abstinence, followed by Ethan's imprisonment. Their daughter was almost a year old, and in that time, she hadn't been intimate with anyone. The stress of Ethan's arrest, the demands of her business, had left her with little time or energy for such things. But Walter's unexpected display had reawakened something within her, a desire she thought she had successfully buried. "Are you crazy, Olivia?" she whispered to herself, mortified by her thoughts. Why was she thinking about a man old enough to be her father? She scolded herself, trying to push the images from her mind. But the memory lingered, haunting her dreams as she finally drifted off to sleep. Olivia woke up later than usual the next morning, the remnants of her restless night clinging to her like a shroud. Despite her exhaustion, the daily routine of the boutique continued, everyone bustling about, attending to their tasks with practiced efficiency. Yet, something felt different. Olivia couldn't shake off a strange self-consciousness, a lingering embarrassment from the previous night. She found herself avoiding Walter's gaze, her cheeks flushing whenever he came near. Thankfully, no one else seemed to notice her unusual behavior. Everyone was too busy with their own work. Walter, oblivious to Olivia's inner turmoil, went about his duties with his usual quiet diligence. He was completely unaware of the pair of eyes that followed his every move, a gaze that lingered a little too long, a little too intently. "He's only human, Olivia," she reminded herself. "He spent most of his life in prison, probably never even touched a woman. It's perfectly understandable." She tried to rationalize his behavior, hoping to quell the unwelcome desires that had been stirred within her. But the day dragged on, each hour feeling longer than the last. Her mind drifted, her focus shattered. Images of Walter, his rough hands, his weathered face, his surprisingly muscular body, kept intruding on her thoughts. The air conditioning hummed, keeping the shop cool and comfortable, but Olivia felt hot, a thin sheen of sweat coating her skin. She was constantly aware of the dampness beneath her arms, between her breasts, at the base of her neck. "Olivia, are you feeling okay?" one of the younger shop assistants asked, noticing her flushed cheeks and distracted air. "Oh, I'm fine," Olivia replied quickly. "Just a little under the weather, I think. It's probably the change in seasons." She forced a smile, then hurried upstairs, desperate to escape the shop, to escape her own thoughts. "You're being ridiculous, Olivia," she muttered to herself as she climbed the stairs. She could see Walter from the upstairs window, still diligently guarding the storefront. "He's a good man, a kind man. He saved Ethan's life in prison. You owe him a debt of gratitude, not lustful thoughts." But despite her best efforts, the images from the previous night refused to fade. She tossed and turned on her bed that night, unable to find peace. What is he doing now? She wondered, her curiosity getting the better of her. She reached for her phone. Ever since opening the boutique, she had installed security cameras throughout the shop and their living quarters. Even the storage room, before it was converted into Walter's room, had been wired with a camera. The contractors had forgotten to move it, and she hadn't bothered to remind them. Now, that forgotten camera provided her with a window into Walter's private world. Her heart hammered in her chest as she opened the camera app and selected the feed from Walter's room. Her eyes widened, her fingers trembling, as the image on the screen came into focus. The scene was almost identical to the one she had witnessed, and dreamed about, the previous night. Walter was lying on his bed, phone in hand, his body moving rhythmically. Olivia felt a jolt of electricity course through her body. Her breath caught in her throat, her own body mirroring the movements she saw on the screen. She couldn't tear her eyes away, her mind growing hazy, her inhibitions melting away. The city outside was silent, the only sound the steady drizzle of a late summer rain. Inside the quiet house, on separate floors, two solitary figures sought release, their bodies burning with a shared need. A flash of lightning illuminated the sky, followed by a deafening clap of thunder that seemed to split the night in two. The house shuddered, the furniture rattling as the storm raged outside. Suddenly, Olivia's daughter woke up, her cries piercing the silence. The sudden noise had startled her from her sleep. Olivia scrambled out of bed, hurriedly pulling her clothes back into place as she rushed to her daughter's side. "Shish, baby, it's okay, Mommy's here," she cooed, picking her up and rocking her gently. But the baby wouldn't stop crying. The storm had terrified her. Olivia tried to feed her, but the baby refused, her tiny body trembling with fear. Desperate, Olivia put her daughter on her shoulder and paced back and forth, singing lullabies. But nothing worked. The baby continued to cry, her little arms reaching out, her eyes searching for comfort. Olivia carried her from room to room, her voice growing hoarse from singing, but the crying continued. Downstairs, Walter, dressed for bed, was startled by the sound of a baby crying. The sound was relentless, heart-wrenching. He felt a surge of sympathy for the child, even though she was a stranger to him. He stepped out of his room and looked up towards the second floor, his heart filled with concern. The crying was unbearable. He started to climb the stairs, intending to offer his help, but hesitated. It was late, and he didn't want to intrude. It didn't feel right, barging into Olivia's room while her husband was away. He retreated to his room, but the crying continued, growing louder with each passing moment. He couldn't ignore it any longer. He hurried back out and climbed the stairs, his heart pounding. Olivia was standing in the hallway, her daughter still crying uncontrollably on her shoulder. She looked up, surprised to see Walter. "What's wrong? Why is she crying so much?" he asked, his voice full of concern. "She must have been startled by the thunder. She woke up crying, and I can't seem to calm her down," Olivia explained, her voice laced with exhaustion. "I've tried everything, feeding her, singing to her, rocking her, nothing works." "Let me try," Walter offered, stepping closer. Olivia hesitated for a moment, then reluctantly handed her daughter to Walter. He had never held a baby before, but some instinct took over. Walter's awkwardness was endearing. He held the baby gingerly, his large, calloused hands seeming too rough for such a delicate creature. There, little one. What's all the fuss about?" he cooed, bouncing the baby gently. As if by magic, the baby's cries began to subside. She stared up at Walter with wide, tear-filled eyes, her tiny body relaxing against his chest. "See? There you go, little one. Uncle Walter's got you," Walter said, his voice taking on a playful tone. He continued to bounce the baby, pacing back and forth, the baby's cries fading into soft hiccups. Olivia, who had been following closely behind, let out a sigh of relief. The tension that had been knotting her shoulders eased. "She's finally quiet," she murmured, watching in amazement as Walter continued to soothe her daughter. "How did you do that? I tried everything, but she wouldn't stop crying." "Maybe she just needed a change of scenery," Walter chuckled, her eyes twinkling. Olivia smiled, her gaze lingering on Walter's face. Maybe she just needed a good dose of grandpa magic, she thought to herself. She couldn't deny the unexpected attraction she felt towards this unlikely savior. "Here, let me take her," she said softly, reaching out for her daughter. Walter carefully handed the baby back to Olivia, his arm brushing against hers once again. A shiver ran down Olivia's spine, and she felt a familiar warmth spread through her body. Walter, oblivious to her reaction, seemed pleased with himself, his face beaming with pride. "There you go, little girl. Back to mama," he said, beaming. Olivia settled back on the bed, cradling her daughter in her arms and offering him her breast. The baby latched on eagerly, her cries now forgotten. Olivia, acting on pure instinct, forgot that Walter was still standing there, watching. Walter started, his mouth agape. He had never seen a woman breastfeed in real life, only in movies. His heart pounded in his chest as he watched Olivia, her body relaxed, her gaze soft and maternal. He felt a surge of longing, a primal urge he couldn't quite understand. He swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry. The sight of the baby suckling at Olivia's breast stirred something deep within him, a yearning he had never dared to acknowledge. He stood there, frozen, his desire as palpable as the humid night air. His gaze lingered on Olivia, his old body betraying him once again. Olivia, catching Walter's gaze, blushed furiously. She realized, with a jolt of mortification, that Walter had been watching her breastfeed. "She's quiet now, Walter. You should get some rest," she said quickly, hoping to diffuse the awkwardness. "Right, yes, of course," Walter mumbled, turning to leave. He was overwhelmed with embarrassment, his escape hampered by the unwelcome stirring in his pants. His footsteps were heavy, as if he was carrying a great weight. Olivia watched Walter retreat, a knowing smile playing on her lips. She couldn't deny the thrill of knowing that she had stirred something within him, a desire that mirrored her own. That night, it was Walter's turn to lie awake, his mind replaying the scene from earlier that evening. The image of Olivia breastfeeding, her body both vulnerable and powerful, was seared into his brain. The attraction was overwhelming, a force he had never encountered before, powerful enough to make his head spin. It wasn't until the first light of dawn crept through the window that he finally drifted off to sleep. He had no idea that his every move, his every fumble, had been observed by Olivia through the watchful eye of the security camera. The next day, Walter felt awkward around Olivia, avoiding her gaze whenever possible. He was mortified by his own thoughts, his own involuntary reaction to her. Olivia, on the other hand, acted as if nothing had happened. She treated Walter with the same kindness and respect as always, her demeanor casual and friendly. Her indifference, rather than putting him at ease, only intensified Walter's guilt. From that night on, Olivia's daughter seemed to have developed a habit of waking up in the middle of the night, her cries echoing through the silent house. On these occasions, if Olivia couldn't soothe her, she would carry her downstairs to Walter's room. It became a familiar routine, Walter's gentle touch and soothing voice calming the baby almost instantly. Walter no longer felt embarrassed around Olivia. He would often find himself sitting with her while she breastfed, their conversations easy and comfortable. Olivia, too, seemed to have lost her initial awkwardness. She would nurse her daughter openly, without a hint of self-consciousness. And it wasn't just breastfeeding. Lately, Olivia's nighttime attire had become increasingly revealing. Whether by accident or design, she seemed to favor flimsy nightgowns and short shorts that showcased her long, slender legs. Some nights, she even wore a sheer negligee, leaving little to the imagination. Walter was tormented. He couldn't help but notice, couldn't help but react. He would clench his fists, trying to control the urge to reach out and touch her. Every night, he found himself seeking release, his fantasies fueled by the images of Olivia that filled his mind. He no longer needed the stimulation of adult films. The mere thought of Olivia was enough to drive him to the brink. He didn't know that Olivia, upstairs in her bedroom, was experiencing a similar torment. Every night, she watched him through the security camera, her body responding to his every movement, her desires mirroring his own. It was a silent, secret communion, their bodies connected by an invisible thread of longing. One night, as Walter lay dozing in his room, the sound of a baby crying pierced the silence. It was like an alarm clock, jolting him awake. He scrambled out of bed and hurried upstairs, his feet instinctively leading him to Olivia's room. The door was ajar, as usual. He peered inside, but Olivia was nowhere in sight. The baby was fussing in her crib. "Walter, can you take him? I'm in the shower," Olivia called out from the bathroom. Walter rushed to the crib, scooping the baby into his arms. The child, soothed by his familiar touch, quieted down almost immediately. Within minutes, she was fast asleep again. Walter gently placed her back in the crib. He glanced around the room, taking in the details he had never noticed before. Despite Olivia's busy schedule, her room was impeccably clean and organized. "She's a remarkable woman," he thought to himself. "Beautiful, capable, and a wonderful mother." His gaze was drawn to the bathroom door, where the sound of running water and the faint scent of lavender filled the air. The bathroom had a glass wall, offering a tantalizing glimpse of the figure showering within. He couldn't make out the details, but he could see the outline of her curves, the steam rising from her wet skin. Walter started, mesmerized. His mouth went dry, his blood rushing to his ears, his eyes burning with a desire he could barely contain. The shower stopped abruptly. "Walter?" Olivia's voice called out, laced with a playful lilt. "Could you grab me some clothes from the bed?" Walter snapped out of his trance, his heart pounding. Sure. He stammered, his eyes darting around the room, trying to regain his bearings. It took him a moment to locate the bed, even though it was right in front of him. His hands trembled as he picked up a pile of soft, silky clothing. The bathroom door opened a crack, revealing a glimpse of Olivia's arm, smooth, pale, and glistening with water droplets. "Just hand them to me," she said. Whether intentional or not, the position of the door, combined with Olivia's extended arm, framed her body in a way that was impossible for Walter to ignore. He felt his resolve crumble. He swallowed hard, his throat dry, his body buzzing with a need that was beyond his control. "Olivia," he breathed, his voice thick with desire. He tossed the clothes onto the floor and lunged forward, pushing the bathroom door open with a bang. "Walter, what are you?" Olivia's protest was cut short as Walter pulled her into his arms. He was like a starving man presented with a feast, his hunger overwhelming any sense of decency or restraint. "Olivia, you're so beautiful," he groaned, his hands roaming over her wet skin. "Walter, stop, this isn't right." Olivia protested weakly, her body betraying her words as she leaned into his touch. "Olivia, please," he whispered, his voice hoarse with need. And then, they were on the bed, their bodies intertwined. The contrast was stark, his age and roughness against her youth and beauty, his darkness against her paleness. Yet, their bodies fit together perfectly, their movements driven by a shared desperation, a shared need for connection. Outside, the storm had subsided, the city slumbering peacefully beneath a blanket of darkness. Inside the room, the only sound was the soft ticking of the clock on the nightstand. It was 4 a.m. The air hung heavy with the scent of sweat and sex, a pungent reminder of the battle that had just taken place. The bed was a disaster zone, sheets tangled, pillows scattered on the floor, tissues crumpled and discarded. Walter lay beside Olivia, his body still thrumming with the aftershocks of their encounter. He couldn't believe it. After a lifetime of deprivation, he had finally lost his virginity, and with a woman as beautiful as Olivia, no less. He gazed at her sleeping form, a mix of awe and regret washing over him. He was both thrilled and ashamed, his conscience battling with his desire. Even now, his body ached for more. He was used to the quick, impersonal satisfaction of his solitary nights. This was something else entirely, a connection he had never imagined possible. He knew it was wrong, terribly wrong. Ethan had been kind to him, had offered him a home, a job, a future. And this was how he repaid him? By sleeping with his wife? The guilt gnawed at him, a bitter taste in his mouth. He couldn't understand Olivia. Why was she doing this? Ethan was a good man, a loving husband. He would be back home in 3 years. Why jeopardize her marriage, her happiness, for a fleeting moment of pleasure with an old man like him? Olivia visited Ethan regularly in prison. There was no sign of guilt or remorse in her demeanor. She spoke of missing him, of longing for his return. She reassured him that everything was fine at home, urging him to focus on his rehabilitation. Walter accompanied her on these visits, his heart heavy with shame. He watched as Ethan, his face open and trusting, greeted him like a father, his words full of gratitude and respect. Each visit was a fresh wound to Walter's conscience. He had to stop this, he told himself. He couldn't betray Ethan's trust any longer. But his resolve weakened every time Olivia touched him, every time her scent filled his nostrils, every time her voice whispered his name in the darkness. She was a master of seduction, her every move, her every word, calculated to ignite the fire within him. He was a puppet, dancing to her tune. "We can't keep doing this, Olivia," he would say, his voice trembling. "Who's going to know, Walter?" she would reply, her voice husky with desire. "It's not like we live in a small town where everyone gossips." "But Ethan." "Don't worry about Ethan. I'm only borrowing you for a little while. Once he's back, I'll be all his again." Her words, both a promise and a threat, left him powerless to resist. And so, 2 years passed. Despite the good food and relatively stress-free life, Walter was starting to show his age. Olivia, on the other hand, had blossomed. Her once slender frame had filled out, her curves becoming more pronounced. She had the plump, contented look of a well-fed hen. Ethan, thanks to good behavior, was granted an early release. On a bright April morning, he stepped out of the prison gates, his face alight with joy as he was greeted by Olivia, their daughter, and Walter. They all piled into the car, Ethan chattering excitedly about his plans for the future. He was determined to make up for lost time, to shower his wife and daughter with the love and attention they had missed. Walter sat in the back seat, his heart heavy with guilt. He watched as Ethan and Olivia exchanged loving glances, their daughter giggling happily in the back seat. He felt like an intruder, a dark shadow looming over their happiness. That night, lying in his room on the ground floor, Walter could hear the muffled sounds of Ethan and Olivia making love. Their laughter and moans echoed through the thin walls, a constant reminder of his betrayal. "Ethan, honey, be quiet. You'll wake the baby," Olivia whispered, her voice laced with laughter. "She's sound asleep, don't worry," Ethan replied. "Besides, I've missed you so much." I know, but remember, we're on the first floor." "Oh, right. Sorry, I forgot." "Well, hurry up then." Walter turned over in his bed, his stomach churning with guilt. He couldn't sleep. He knew that Ethan still considered him a friend, a benefactor. The thought of what he had done, the trust he had betrayed, was unbearable. At 3 a.m., Walter got out of bed and packed his meager belongings into his old duffel bag. He had saved up almost $10,000 during his time working at the boutique. It wasn't much, but it was enough to start over. He left a note for Olivia, explaining his departure, then quietly slipped out of the house. By 5 a.m., he was back in Willow Creek. The house where he had grown up, now occupied by his cousin, was still standing, its whitewashed walls faded but still sturdy. His cousin, surprised to see him, welcomed him warmly. After a few weeks, Walter used his savings to buy some paint and new roof tiles, giving the old house a much-needed facelift. He bought himself a dog for company, and settled into a quiet life, his days spent tending to his small garden and his evenings reading by the fire. The village had changed, and no one recognized him anymore. His past was a secret, known only to a handful of people his own age. But even they didn't seem to care. He was just another face in the crowd, a ghost from a forgotten past. He found a strange peace in this anonymity, a sense of belonging he had never felt before. The countryside was quiet, the air clean, the pace of life slow and predictable. It was a world away from the chaos and temptations of the city, a world where he could finally find some measure of redemption. A week later, Ethan and Olivia, with their daughter in tow, decided to visit Willow Creek. It was a homecoming for Ethan, a chance to reconnect with his roots and catch up with old friends and family. They spent the day reminiscing, laughing, and sharing stories. Towards the evening, they decided to pay Walter a visit. They found him living a simple life, his days filled with gardening and quiet contemplation. Ethan couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy for the older man. He seemed so lonely, so out of touch with the world. It was time, Ethan thought, for Walter to find someone, a companion to share his life with. An idea struck him. "Olivia, what about your Aunt Susan?" he asked. "She's been a widow for years. She lives just down the road. We saw her earlier today, remember?" "That's a great idea," Olivia exclaimed. "She's a wonderful woman, and she could definitely use some company." And so, Ethan and Olivia, with a little matchmaking magic, set about bringing Walter and Susan together. They arranged casual encounters, invented excuses for Walter to visit Susan's house, and generally made sure the two were constantly in each other's orbit. Their plan worked. Walter, drawn to Susan's warmth and kindness, found himself falling in love. Susan, lonely and yearning for companionship, responded to Walter's quiet strength and gentle nature. They were married within a few months, and to everyone's surprise, Susan, at the age of 48, found herself pregnant. Walter was overjoyed. He was going to be a father, a husband, a real family man, a dream he had long given up on. His life, which had been a series of trials and tribulations, had finally found its happy ending. And that, dear listeners, is the end of our story. Walter, after enduring years of wrongful imprisonment, found freedom and redemption. He faced the consequences of his actions, the guilt of his betrayal, and ultimately, found peace and happiness in the most unexpected of places. Despite his mistakes, he found the courage to choose the right path, to make amends for his past, and to build a future filled with love and family. Thank you for listening. Until next time, may your lives be filled with joy and second chances.